Long gave a very good review of the Nexus 5X, saying that LG built upon what was already loved in the Nexus 5. And even if it wasn't necessarily the full flagship status that the Nexus 6P was, at least the 5X is still a very good phone to have on the daily. Well, I've been using the 5X as my daily driver for a little while, and I have a few things that I have to say about it. It's Josh Vergara from Android Authority. What's going on, everybody? And these are my second opinions on the Nexus 5X. Now, a lot about what I have to say about the Nexus 5X in this second opinion video has to do with the performance, but for now we're going to just skim through the rest of the sections and I'll give you a couple of opinions that I have on them as we go along. The design is still one of my favorites. The Nexus 5 was a very well received device, and even if it wasn't the sturdiest phone out there, it was still very easy to use, especially in one hand given its materials and also its size. Now we have the same thing here in the Nexus 5X, except we have this two-tone coloration which has grown on me a little bit but doesn't necessarily have that more, let's say, unified look that the Nexus 5 had. But this black and white still looks pretty good. And again, this is not a very sturdy device. If you're going to drop it, I'm sure there are going to be some cracks all over the place, and the soft plastic will get damaged pretty easily, as mine has already gotten a couple of stains on this white backing. But overall, it is a design that is incredibly enjoyable and really fits the lower end of the two Nexus devices. The same will go for the display. We're obviously not going to be working with Quad HD here. 1080p resolution is perfectly fine still though, and this particular display is still nice to have and is easy to view in broad daylight and is very fun to use for everything from work and play. Unfortunately, it's only when you really compare the display with another display, like for example the AMOLED display of the Nexus 6P, that you see some of its shortcomings. It doesn't necessarily have really high contrast, the black levels are a little bit washed out, and it's just that little bit without the punch in the colors that the Nexus 6P's AMOLED screen has, but that doesn't detract from what is already a pretty good experience to have on the daily. And finally, let's get into the performance, which is where most of what I have to say is in here. Okay, so the Snapdragon 808 is still a good performing processor, and it may not be the 810, but it also has one other detraction from it, and that is the 2 GB of RAM. Now, when it comes to general daily tasks, you're not really doing too much on the phone, maybe going through maybe 2 or 3 applications, especially not ones that are necessarily all that demanding. You're going to get a good time basically just multitasking and going through all the different elements of this marshmallow version of Android. While that's all good and dandy, what I found is that when the power user experience kind of came into it, that's when the 808 really showed its colors. There are plenty of times that I've been able to overload this device, especially with its 2 GB of RAM, which kind of seems a little bit paltry, especially nowadays when we're kind of expecting 3 GB. And ultimately what would happen is I have 3 different tasks that are very high demanding that I do pretty much every day. That's either GPS navigation, a lot of music or podcast playing in the background, and then using the camera for when I need it. What would happen is when I would load all 3 of them at the same time for whatever reason, one situation had me driving along the side of the road with a podcast playing and I was being directed to my destination, and then as I was at a stoplight I needed to take a picture of something that I thought was pretty funny. The camera just wouldn't load. Now you're going to see in this shot right here that there's really no lag on here, and actually I will say that that's about 80% of the time with the Nexus 5X. You're going to have a pretty smooth transition from all of the different applications. The performance will be fine, especially when you're in really good conditions. And in this shot right here, the phone was actually just refreshed. It was turned off and then turned back on. And the other thing I noticed is that when the device is not all that warm, then it performs at its peak. When the device is warm, like many smartphones that I've used over this past year or so, it does tend to slow down just a little bit because it's working a little bit harder under a warmer condition. As far as the other aspects go, I am focusing mostly on the performance aspect in this second opinion. Now, Lon is not wrong in terms of saying that the performance has been pretty good, but it's not something you're going to get 100% of the time. And while that might be true for a lot of phones out there, the Nexus 5X seem to show those colors more often than not. But everything else has been really great. In terms of hardware, the fingerprint reader is definitely something I'm really used to now, and I actually find myself on other phones reaching for the back where I would think the fingerprint reader is because I got so used to it on these Nexus devices. The USB Type-C standard is still something I'm trying to get used to. If you have a lot of charging docks and let's say even external batteries that have the regular USB connection on there, then you're going to need to get the new cables in order to actually take advantage of the USB Type-C standard and charge this properly. But fast charging on this has been great, and battery life has been for the most part standard. On very power heavy days, I did get maybe 2.5 hours of battery life on here, which was fine, and then I would get 3.5 hours if I wasn't using the phone quite as much. Doze, on the other hand, has been doing a good job, but I did have one thing I needed to say there. If you're using any Doze enhanced or Doze capable phone, make sure that you put your applications under the priority list, because obviously Doze will keep notifications from coming in during its very low power state. Now, the reason why I say that is because Cloud Magic, which is the app that I use for all of my email needs, was not on that list, and every time I would pick up the phone and wake it back up, a flood of notifications would come in. So maybe that's something you figured out by now with your versions of the Nexus or Doze capable devices, but I felt like I needed to say that because it happened on more than one occasion. The camera has also been really good. I have no problems with the camera here on the Nexus 5X. The only thing that's missing is optical image stabilization, and in tests that I've done with the Nexus 6P already against other phones that have OIS, we did find that OIS just sort of had the edge there, though the larger sensor of the Nexus phones definitely does a great job of enhancing what in the past was a lackluster experience in these phones. The camera experience is really good, and when I was at a couple of, let's say, events, the phone in my pocket was the Nexus 5X, and I was more than happy to just use that to capture the memories, and that was really great. And then finally, in software has been honestly one of the best parts about this. Not only do you have optimizations and new features in this Marshmallow version of Android, but it all is under pretty much a very eye candy-like appeal. Like, you have the vertical scroll with the one line of applications at the top of the app drawer that you probably use most, and I end up using that all the time and find myself wishing for it when I go to other phones. Google Now on Tab is nice as well, but I don't find myself using it quite as much. But nonetheless, what we have here is a great version of Android, probably one of the best that we've had in a while, because it actually adds some functionality while making sure that the optimizations are as good as they can be. And with the Snapdragon 808 in here, it is able to go pretty smoothly. It's just in those small instances and under maybe less than ideal circumstances that you might actually get some slowdown. I really wanted to love this phone, and in a lot of ways I do, but I have a few main caveats with it, and it has to do with the performance. On way more than a few occasions did I have an issue of actually getting the stuff that I wanted to done, and the little bit of lag that would keep me from, let's say, even typing using Flexi on here, or even the amount of time that I would have to wait for certain applications to just load up, or even the times that it would crash when trying to load Crossy Road. All of them kind of came up more often than I really wanted them to, and I was really hoping that the Nexus 5X with the Snapdragon 808 and the 2 GB of RAM was still going to prove that with a good version of Android optimized properly, we were still going to not have all of those performance issues, but unfortunately they did come up for me. Now, I'm sure that a lot of you out there have been using the Nexus 5X, and you've probably experienced these as well, and for the most part, given the whole package, it is probably something that you can sort of put over to the side and think it's really not all that bad. I agree with you. The Nexus 5X is still a good budget phone if you need to save a little bit of money, and if that is your prerogative, then yes, go for this phone. It is a really good one and provides a lot of the best Android experiences out there. It just slows down from time to time. So keep it tuned to Android Authority, and with this video, I am officially now on my extended break. I will be gone for the month of December, but of course you are in good hands with the rest of Android Authority, so make sure you watch all of the content from my colleagues in Android here, and make sure you stay tuned for all of our holiday videos. We're going to have a lot of them, and when the new year comes around, you're going to see me back at CES. So keep it tuned to Android Authority for that and even more. Download the Android Authority app over in the corner so you can keep in touch with all of us and keep in touch with all of our content. And when you're done with all of that, stick around for even more, because we are your source for all things Android.